The young foal stood trembling on James Morrison's porch that morning, its eyes burning with a desperate intelligence that made the veteran's blood run cold. When he followed the exhausted animal through miles of tangled woods to an abandoned barn, what he found waiting in the darkness would force him to make a choice that would cost him everything he had left. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet countryside as retired Army veteran James Morrison sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming his weathered hands. At 62 years old, James had seen more than most men would in 3 lifetimes. 25 years of military service had taken him to distant lands, through conflicts that still haunted his dreams, and eventually back to this small farm in rural Montana where he now lived alone. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been harder than he'd ever imagined. The silence that once brought him peace now amplified the memories he tried so hard to forget. His modest property consisted of 15 acres of grassland, a small barn that had seen better days, and a house that creaked with every gust of wind. James had purchased the land 3 years ago with his retirement savings, hoping that the solitude and simple life of farming would help heal the wounds that weren't visible to the naked eye. He'd been told by his therapist at the VA hospital that working with animals could be therapeutic, but so far, he'd only managed to acquire 2 aging chickens and a temperamental goat named Sergeant who seemed to share his distrust of strangers. The veteran took another sip of his coffee, watching the golden light spread across his property. It was in these quiet moments that he felt the weight of his solitude most heavily. His ex-wife had left years ago, unable to cope with the man who had returned from his final deployment. His daughter, now 28, called occasionally but lived 3 states away with her own family. James understood. He wasn't easy to be around. The nightmares, the sudden reactions to loud noises, the emotional walls he'd built had pushed away everyone who'd tried to get close. As he sat there lost in thought, something unusual caught his attention. Movement near the tree line at the edge of his property. James squinted, his military training automatically kicking in as he assessed the situation. It wasn't a deer, too small and moving too deliberately. Setting down his coffee cup, he stood and walked to the edge of his porch, one hand instinctively reaching for the railing as his bad knee protested the sudden movement. What he saw made him freeze in disbelief. A young foal, no more than a few months old, was making its way across his field. But this wasn't the casual wandering of a lost animal. The foal was moving with purpose, stopping every few yards to look back toward the tree line, then continuing forward, directly toward his house. Its coat was a rich chestnut brown, matted with dirt and what appeared to be dried sweat. Even from this distance, James could see the animal was exhausted. The foal stumbled slightly, its thin legs shaking with effort, but it kept coming. James descended the porch steps slowly, not wanting to startle the creature. He'd grown up around horses before his military career, back when his grandfather's ranch had been a thriving operation. He knew enough to recognize that this foal was in distress. As he got closer, he could see scratches on its legs and flanks, evidence of pushing through brush and brambles. When the foal was about 20 feet away, it stopped and looked directly at James. In that moment, the veteran felt something shift inside him. The animal's eyes held an intelligence and desperation that reminded him of soldiers he'd seen on the battlefield, those who had pushed beyond their limits to seek help for wounded comrades. The foal took another tentative step forward, and then, to James's absolute astonishment, it made a sound, a desperate whinny that seemed to carry more meaning than simple animal distress. James crouched down slowly, ignoring the protest from his knee, and extended his hand. The foal approached, trembling with exhaustion, and pressed its muzzle against his palm. The veteran felt the animal's rapid breathing, saw the fear and urgency in its eyes, and understood with startling clarity that this young horse had come seeking help. It wasn't lost. It was on a mission. Standing carefully, James looked in the direction from which the foal had come. The tree line bordered the neighboring property, an abandoned ranch that had been empty for over a year since old Mr. Henderson had passed away. The place had fallen into disrepair, the fences broken, the barn collapsing. James had heard rumors that some of Henderson's horses had gone wild after his death, but he'd never paid much attention. Now, as he looked at this desperate young foal, he realized something was terribly wrong. The foal began to move again, walking a few steps back toward the tree line, then stopping to look at James. The message was unmistakable. It wanted him to follow. The veteran hesitated, years of isolation and mistrust making him question whether he should get involved. He'd worked so hard to keep the world at arm's length, to avoid connections that might cause pain. But as he looked into the foal's pleading eyes, something long dormant stirred within him. This creature had chosen him, had somehow known to seek him out, and that choice awakened a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since his last deployment. James walked back to his house, moving as quickly as his injuries would allow. He grabbed his old military medical kit, something he'd kept out of habit, and a length of rope from his barn. Whatever was waiting in those woods, he needed to be prepared. As he returned to where the foal waited, he felt his heart beating faster. Not from fear or anxiety, but from something he'd almost forgotten. The feeling of being needed, of having a mission. The foal immediately started moving when it saw him, leading him toward the unknown, and James Morrison, retired veteran and self-imposed hermit, found himself following without hesitation into a situation that would change everything he thought he knew about healing, connection, and the unexpected ways that salvation can arrive. The journey through the overgrown path tested every bit of James's physical endurance. Branches caught at his clothes, thorns scraped his arms, and his bad knee throbbed with each uneven step. The foal moved ahead with surprising agility despite its obvious exhaustion, occasionally looking back to ensure James was still following. The veteran pushed through the discomfort, his military training helping him focus past the pain. He'd marched through worse terrain carrying 80 pounds of gear. This was nothing, he told himself, even as sweat began to bead on his forehead in the morning heat. As they penetrated deeper into the abandoned Henderson property, James noticed signs of neglect everywhere. Broken fence posts jutted from the ground like broken teeth, their wire tangled in the weeds. The path, once maintained for farm vehicles, had surrendered to nature's reclamation. Wildflowers and tall grass obscured what had been clear ground, and saplings had begun their slow conquest of what had once been open pasture. The foal navigated through it all with the confidence of familiarity, clearly having made this journey before, though James couldn't fathom how many times or under what circumstances. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, they emerged into a clearing where the old Henderson barn stood. James stopped, taking in the structure's deteriorated state. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, several boards had fallen away, leaving gaping holes in the walls, and the main door hung askew on rusted hinges. It was a miracle the whole thing hadn't collapsed yet. The foal didn't hesitate, making directly for an opening where boards had rotted away near the ground, small enough for a young horse to squeeze through, but too small for a man. James circled the building, looking for a safer entry point. The main door proved to be his best option, though he had to use considerable force to push it open enough to slip through. The hinges screamed in protest, and the sound echoed in the cavernous space inside. As his eyes adjusted to the dim interior, filtering through gaps in the walls and roof, James's breath caught in his throat. There, in what had once been a large stall, lay a mare. She was a beautiful chestnut horse, her coat the same rich color as the foal's, and even in her current state, James could see she had once been magnificent. But the mare was in terrible condition. She lay on her side, her breathing labored and shallow, her eyes half closed in evident suffering. One of her legs was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and around the injury, the flesh was swollen and discolored. The foal immediately went to her, nuzzling her face and making soft sounds that broke something deep inside James's chest. The mare barely responded, just a slight movement of her head to acknowledge her baby's presence. James approached slowly, speaking in the calm, steady voice he'd learned to use with frightened soldiers and scared animals alike. As he got closer, the full extent of the situation became clear. The mare had been trapped in this barn for days, perhaps longer. There was no food within reach, and while she might have had access to some rainwater that had leaked through the roof, it wouldn't have been nearly enough. The broken leg was bad, but James suspected dehydration and shock were equally life-threatening at this point. Kneeling beside the mare, James gently ran his hand along her neck, checking her vital signs as best he could with his limited veterinary knowledge. Her skin was hot and dry, her pulse rapid and weak. The foal pressed against him, as if urging him to do something, anything to help. The veteran found himself fighting back emotions he'd kept locked away for years. This mare, trapped and suffering while her baby desperately sought help, reminded him too much of situations he'd faced in combat. Soldiers calling for medics, their comrades staying by their sides, refusing to leave them behind. James pulled out his cell phone, silently cursing himself for not thinking of it sooner. No signal. Of course there wasn't. The Henderson property was in a dead zone, something the old man had complained about regularly. James would have to go back to his house to make calls, but he couldn't just leave. He needed to at least try to stabilize the mare to give her some comfort and a fighting chance until professional help could arrive. Working quickly, he assessed what he could do with his limited supplies. The medical kit he'd brought contained basic first aid supplies, nothing designed for a horse, but the principles were the same across species. He found a relatively clean section of the barn where he could access some old buckets. One still held a bit of stagnant water, which he carefully poured out. He'd need to bring fresh water from his property, and quickly. The mare's broken leg was the most obvious injury, but James knew better than to move it without proper equipment and expertise. What he could do was try to make her more comfortable and address the immediate threats to her life. Dehydration was killing her as surely as the broken bone. He examined the leg more closely without touching it, noting the angle and severity of the break. In his gut, he knew what any rancher would say. A break this bad in a horse, especially one that had been left untreated for days, was usually a death sentence. The humane thing would be to end her suffering. But as he looked at the foal, standing vigil over its mother with such devoted determination, James felt something shift inside him. This young animal had done something extraordinary. It had somehow understood that help was needed and had gone to find it. It had chosen James specifically, crossing property lines, navigating dangerous terrain, approaching a human stranger. That kind of intelligence, that depth of love and determination, deserved more than a surrender to the conventional wisdom that said this mare was beyond saving. James made a decision. He wasn't going to give up on her. Not yet. Not while the foal looked at him with those desperate, pleading eyes. Not while there was even the smallest chance she could be saved. He'd seen soldiers survive injuries that should have killed them. He'd witnessed miracles born from sheer determination and refusal to accept the inevitable. Maybe, just maybe, this mare had that same fighter's spirit. Standing up with renewed determination, James looked down at the foal and spoke aloud, as much to himself as to the young horse. He told the foal he would be back, that he was going to get help, that they weren't going to give up on its mother. The foal seemed to understand, settling down next to the mare but watching James with eyes that held both hope and fear. As the veteran made his way back through the overgrown path, moving as quickly as his battered body would allow, his mind raced through everything he needed to do and everyone he needed to call. James burst through his front door with more energy than he'd summoned in years, immediately grabbing his phone and scrolling through contacts he rarely used. His hands shook slightly, whether from exertion or adrenaline he couldn't tell. The first call went to Dr. Patterson, the local veterinarian who'd helped him with Sergeant the goat when the ornery animal had eaten something toxic. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. James left a rushed message, his words tumbling over each other as he tried to convey the urgency of the situation without sounding like a madman. Next, he tried the emergency veterinary clinic in Billings, 40 miles away. A receptionist answered with practiced cheerfulness that grated against James's frayed nerves. He explained the situation as clearly as he could, describing the mare's condition and location. There was a pause on the other end, then a sympathetic but discouraging response. The on-call veterinarian was currently in surgery and wouldn't be available for at least 3 hours. Moreover, the receptionist gently informed him a horse with a severely broken leg that had been untreated for days would likely require euthanasia. The cost of attempting treatment, even if it were possible, would run into thousands of dollars. Did he want to schedule the euthanasia visit instead? James felt frustration rising in his chest, that old familiar anger that had gotten him into trouble during his early transition to civilian life. He forced it down, thanked the receptionist through gritted teeth, and ended the call. Standing in his kitchen, he looked around at the modest space that reflected his simple life. His retirement check covered his basic needs with little left over. He had some savings, money he'd been setting aside without any particular purpose, just the military habit of preparing for emergencies. Was this an emergency worth spending it on? A horse he didn't own, on property that wasn't his, when everyone with professional expertise was essentially telling him it was a lost cause? The image of the foal's desperate eyes flashed through his mind, followed by the mare's labored breathing and the way she'd tried to lift her head when her baby returned. James had spent 3 years avoiding connection, avoiding responsibility for anything beyond his own small circle of survival. He'd convinced himself it was easier this way, safer. But standing in his kitchen with his heart pounding and purpose flooding through him for the first time in years, he realized how empty that safety had been. He made 3 more calls. The first was to Martha Chen, a ranch owner he'd met at the feed store who'd mentioned she bred horses. She answered on the second ring, and James launched into his explanation. Martha listened patiently, asked a few pointed questions about the mare's condition, and then sighed heavily. She told him honestly that the situation sounded grim, but she knew someone who might help. She gave him the number for a veterinarian named Sarah Brennan, a woman who'd recently moved to the area and had a reputation for taking on difficult cases that other vets wouldn't touch. Martha warned him, though, Dr. Brennan didn't come cheap, and even she might consider this horse beyond saving. James dialed the number immediately. This time, fortune smiled on him. Dr. Brennan answered her own phone, her voice crisp and professional, but not unkind. James found himself explaining everything again, and to his surprise, he mentioned details he hadn't included in previous calls. He told her about how the foal had come to him specifically, how it had led him to its mother, how it now stood watch with a devotion that reminded him of soldiers who refused to leave fallen comrades behind. He told her he was a veteran, that he understood triage in impossible situations, but that something about this felt different. Something about this felt like it mattered. There was a long pause after he finished speaking. Then Dr. Brennan asked him a question that caught him off guard. She asked if he was prepared for the possibility that despite everyone's best efforts, the mare might not survive. Was he ready to invest time, money, and emotional energy into a fight that might end in heartbreak? James thought about the question seriously, glancing out his window toward the Henderson property. He told her yes. He told her he'd rather try and fail than not try at all, that he'd learned the hard way that the attempts you don't make are the ones that haunt you forever. Dr. Brennan said she'd come. She told him to gather as much fresh water as he could carry and get back to the mare immediately. Hydration was critical. She'd be there within 90 minutes, possibly sooner if traffic cooperated. She warned him again about costs, stating firmly that an emergency call plus what would likely be extensive treatment could easily exceed $5,000, possibly much more if surgery was required. James swallowed hard but confirmed he understood. They'd figure out the details later. Right now, the mare needed help. After hanging up, James moved with military efficiency. He filled every container he could find with fresh water, loaded them into his old pickup truck along with some clean tarps, his camping gear that included a portable light and anything else he thought might be useful. He grabbed some carrots and apples from his kitchen, thinking the foal might be hungry even if the mare couldn't eat. His medical kit went back into the truck bed, along with some old blankets that might provide comfort or warmth. As he worked, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose, direction. The feeling of being part of something larger than his own small world of isolation and routine. His therapist had tried to explain this concept to him, how veterans often struggled with the loss of mission and unit cohesion. James had nodded along during those sessions, but never really understood. Now, loading supplies into his truck with the single-minded focus of preparing for a critical operation, he understood completely. The drive across his property and through the broken fence line onto the Henderson land took only minutes, but he had to take it slow to avoid spilling water or damaging his truck's undercarriage on the rough terrain. When he reached the clearing near the barn, he parked as close as he could and began unloading. The physical labor felt good, purposeful. Each bucket of water carried into the barn, each item positioned for potential use, was a small victory against the chaos of the situation. Inside the barn, the foal raised its head at his return, and James could have sworn he saw relief in those large, dark eyes. The mare's condition appeared unchanged, which he took as a small blessing. At least she hadn't deteriorated further. James set up his camping light, positioning it to provide illumination without shining directly in the mare's eyes. Then carefully, he approached with a bucket of fresh water and a large sponge he'd brought. Kneeling beside the mare's head, James spoke softly to her, introducing himself as if she could understand. He moistened the sponge and carefully squeezed water into the corner of her mouth. At first, there was no response, and fear gripped him that she might be too far gone. But then her tongue moved slightly, and she swallowed. It was a tiny thing, barely noticeable, but to James it was everything. She was still fighting, still hanging on. He continued the slow process of hydrating her, being patient, talking to her constantly in that same calm voice he'd used with wounded soldiers, telling her help was coming, that she just needed to hold on a little longer. Time moved strangely in that dim barn. James continued his careful work of hydrating the mare, pausing occasionally to check his watch and calculate how much longer until Dr. Brennan would arrive. The foal had settled nearby, watching every movement James made with an intensity that was almost human in its focus. Between administering water to the mare, James took time to examine the young horse more carefully. The foal was male, probably around 4 months old, and despite the ordeal he'd been through, he showed signs of good breeding and care before whatever had led to this tragedy. James found himself talking to both horses, filling the silence with a steady stream of words. He told them about his life, things he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone in years. He talked about growing up on his grandfather's ranch, about the first horse he'd ever ridden, a gentle mare named Daisy, who'd had infinite patience with a clumsy 7-year-old boy. He talked about joining the military at 18, driven by a desire to serve and see the world beyond Montana's borders. He even found himself sharing things about his deployments, carefully edited versions that focused on the camaraderie and the landscape rather than the violence and loss. As he spoke, something unexpected happened. The tightness in his chest, that constant companion he'd carried since his discharge, began to ease. The words flowed more freely, and with them came a release he hadn't known he needed. The mare's breathing seemed to stabilize as he worked, whether from the hydration or simply from the calm presence and steady voice, James couldn't say. The foal edged closer, eventually resting his head against James's shoulder as the veteran sat back on his heels, taking a moment to rest his aching knee. The weight of the young horse's head, the trust implicit in that simple gesture, cracked something open inside James. His eyes stung with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. He'd been so focused on staying strong, on keeping his emotions locked down and controlled, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be present with genuine feeling. Here in this decrepit barn with two horses who had no reason to trust him, James Morrison finally let his guard down. He lost track of time until the sound of a vehicle approaching snapped him back to awareness. James stood quickly, his knee protesting the sudden movement, and moved to the barn entrance. A white truck with a veterinary practice logo pulled up, and a woman in her late 30s jumped out with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Sarah Brennan was tall and lean, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. She grabbed 2 large cases from her truck and headed straight for the barn, barely acknowledging James beyond a quick nod. Her eyes went immediately to the mare, and James watched her face carefully, trying to read whether she saw any hope in the situation. Dr. Brennan set down her cases and knelt beside the mare, her hands moving with practiced expertise as she began her examination. She checked vital signs, examined the broken leg with gentle thoroughness, and performed several other assessments that James couldn't fully interpret. The foal, who'd been wary when the stranger first entered, seemed to sense that this human was there to help. He stayed close but didn't interfere, his eyes moving between his mother and the veterinarian with anxious attention. Dr. Brennan worked in focused silence for what felt like an eternity, occasionally making notes on a tablet she'd pulled from her case. Finally, she sat back and looked at James with an expression that was difficult to read. She told him the situation was as serious as they'd discussed on the phone. The mare's leg was badly broken in multiple places, the kind of injury that in a wild horse would be fatal. The surrounding tissue showed signs of infection beginning to set in, and the dehydration had stressed her system severely. Dr. Brennan's professional assessment was that the mare had maybe a 30% chance of survival, and that was being optimistic. Even if she survived, she might never walk properly again, and the recovery would be long, painful, and expensive. She needed to be clear about this before they proceeded. Was James certain he wanted to try? James looked at the mare, then at the foal who was watching him with those impossibly expressive eyes. He thought about the journey that young horse had made to find him, about the determination and love that had driven a baby animal to do something so far beyond normal behavior. He thought about all the times in his military career when he'd faced impossible odds, when the smart money said to retreat or surrender, but something deeper had pushed him to try anyway. He thought about the person he'd become in the last 3 years, isolated and going through the motions of living without really being alive. Looking Dr. Brennan in the eye, James told her he was certain. Whatever it took, whatever it cost, he wanted to give this mare every possible chance. He could see his answer surprised her slightly, as if she'd expected him to reconsider when faced with the harsh reality. But she nodded, a glimmer of respect showing in her expression, and told him they should get started immediately. Time was critical. Every hour that passed reduced the mare's chances. What followed was a crash course in emergency veterinary medicine. Dr. Brennan set up an IV line for fluids and antibiotics, explaining each step as she worked. She told James she'd need to sedate the mare to properly examine and stabilize the leg, which carried its own risks given the horse's weakened state. but it had to be done. She couldn't transport the mare without first ensuring the leg wouldn't cause further damage during the move. Yes, she confirmed when James asked. They'd need to move her. She had a facility about 20 miles away with proper equipment, and that's where the mare needed to be if they were going to attempt serious treatment. James watched as Dr. Brennan administered the sedative, her movements confident but gentle. The mare's eyes began to droop, and her labored breathing eased slightly as the medication took effect. The foal became agitated, not understanding why his mother was becoming less responsive, and James found himself stepping in to comfort the young horse. He stroked the foal's neck and spoke softly, explaining as if the animal could understand that this was necessary, that they were trying to help. Dr. Brennan worked quickly once the mare was sedated, carefully manipulating the broken leg and wrapping it in a temporary splint. She explained that this was just to stabilize it for transport. The real work would come later, possibly surgery, definitely weeks of intensive care. As she worked, she asked James questions about how he'd found the mare, and he told her the full story of the foal's remarkable journey to his porch that morning. When he finished, Dr. Brennan paused in her work and looked at him with something like wonder. She said in her 15 years of practice, she'd never heard of anything quite like that. Animals were smart, often more than people gave them credit for, but what that foal had done required not just intelligence, but reasoning and problem-solving that was extraordinary. She looked at the young horse with new appreciation, then back at James. Whatever happened with the mare, she told him, that foal was special, very special, and his devotion to his mother deserved every effort they could give. Transporting the mare proved to be one of the most challenging operations James had participated in since leaving active duty. Dr. Brennan had called for a specialized horse trailer equipped with padding and support systems designed for injured animals, but it would take time to arrive. In the meantime, they worked to keep the mare stable and comfortable. James found himself following Dr. Brennan's instructions with the same precision he'd once applied to following orders in the field, and she seemed to appreciate his ability to stay calm under pressure and execute tasks efficiently without needing repeated explanations. The foal presented an unexpected complication. He refused to leave his mother's side, becoming increasingly distressed whenever James or Dr. Brennan tried to gently guide him away. The young horse would plant his feet and resist, then immediately return to press against the mare's side. Dr. Brennan explained that separating them would cause unnecessary stress for both animals, and stress was something the mare couldn't afford right now. They'd have to transport the foal along with his mother, which meant ensuring the trailer had space for both and that the young horse wouldn't accidentally interfere with the mare's stabilized leg during the journey. While they waited for the trailer, Dr. Brennan took the opportunity to teach James more about the mare's condition and what the coming days and weeks would entail. She explained that the broken leg was actually 3 separate fractures in the cannon bone and fetlock joint, the equine equivalent of breaking multiple bones in a human forearm and wrist. The infection that was beginning to develop was their most immediate concern beyond basic stabilization. If the infection spread into the bone, it would likely prove fatal no matter what other treatments they attempted. James listened intently, asking questions that revealed his military medical training. He understood sepsis and systemic infection, had seen what happened when wounds went untreated in field conditions. Dr. Brennan seemed impressed by his knowledge and began speaking to him less like a worried pet owner and more like a colleague. She outlined the treatment plan, starting with aggressive antibiotic therapy and round-the-clock monitoring. If the mare responded well over the next 48 hours, they could consider surgery to properly set the bones. Recovery, if she survived, would take months. When the transport trailer finally arrived, operated by a young man named Kyle, who worked with Dr. Brennan's practice, the process of loading the mare began. Despite the sedation, The mare showed signs of distress as they carefully maneuvered her onto a specialized stretcher and then into the trailer. The foal became frantic, whinnying loudly and trying to follow. James made a split-second decision, climbing into the trailer himself to guide the foal inside and keep both horses calm during the transfer. Dr. Brennan started to protest, citing safety concerns, but James assured her he knew what he was doing. Inside the trailer, James positioned himself where he could monitor both horses. The foal immediately calmed once he was beside his mother again, and James kept a steady hand on his neck, speaking in that low, calm voice he'd been using all day. The mare's eyes, glazed from sedation and pain, seemed to find his face, and he felt an absurd but powerful conviction that she understood he was trying to help. He told her to hang on, that they were taking her somewhere safe, somewhere she could heal. The foal pressed against his side, and James realized with some surprise that he felt needed in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The 20-mile journey to Dr. Brennan's facility felt endless. Every bump in the road made James wince, worried about causing the mare additional pain or disturbing the temporary splint. He braced himself against the trailer's padded walls, trying to absorb some of the movement and keep both horses as steady as possible. The foal remained pressed against him the entire time, drawing comfort from his presence, and James found himself drawing comfort right back. There was something profoundly healing about being trusted so completely by these animals who had every reason to fear humans after being abandoned and left to suffer. When they finally arrived at Dr. Brennan's facility, James was struck by how professional and well-equipped it was. The property featured a modern veterinary clinic attached to several spacious stables designed for recovery and rehabilitation. Dr. Brennan clearly ran a serious operation, which gave James hope even as it reminded him of the significant costs this was all going to entail. He pushed those worries aside. He'd made his decision, and he wasn't going to second-guess it now. Unloading the mare required even more care than loading her had taken. Dr. Brennan had prepared a special stall with deep bedding and support slings that could be adjusted to take weight off the injured leg once the mare could stand. For now, though, they positioned her carefully on her side in the padded space, ensuring she was as comfortable as possible. The foal followed immediately, and Dr. Brennan made the practical decision to let him stay in the same stall. Keeping them together would reduce stress, and the stall was large enough to accommodate both safely. Once the mare was settled, Dr. Brennan got to work in earnest. She had James assist her, explaining that she could call in her technician, but that having someone who could follow instructions and stay calm was more valuable than someone who might panic at the sight of a suffering animal. James appreciated the confidence she showed in him and threw himself into the work. They administered additional fluids, started a more aggressive antibiotic regimen, and applied proper wound care to the various scrapes and abrasions on the mare's body beyond the broken leg. Throughout all of this, James watched Dr. Brennan work with growing admiration. She was methodical but compassionate, efficient but never rushed. She talked to the mare constantly, explaining what she was doing as if the horse could understand, and she showed genuine care for both animals. When the foal got in the way, she gently redirected him rather than becoming frustrated. James realized he was seeing someone who had found their calling and pursued it with complete dedication. As the afternoon wore into evening, Dr. Brennan finally stepped back and surveyed their work. She told James the mare had survived the transport and initial treatment, which was a positive sign. The next 72 hours would be critical. They needed to see improvement in her vital signs, evidence that the antibiotics were fighting the infection, and most importantly, the will to live from the mare herself. Animals, Dr. Brennan explained, sometimes simply gave up when injuries were severe. It was as if they made a decision that the fight wasn't worth it. This mare would need to choose to keep fighting. James looked at the foal, who had finally settled down next to his mother, exhaustion overtaking his anxiety. He thought about the journey that young horse had made, the determination he'd shown, the impossible task he'd accomplished. If devotion like that couldn't inspire the mare to fight, James didn't know what would. He asked Dr. Brennan what happened next, and she told him honestly that someone would need to monitor the mare constantly through the night, checking vital signs every 2 hours, watching for any signs of distress or improvement. Before Dr. Brennan could continue, James volunteered. He told her he'd stay through the night and handle the monitoring. She started to object, explaining that it was a demanding task and that she had staff who could do it. But James insisted. He'd started this mission, and he was going to see it through. Besides, he told her with a slight smile that felt strange on his face after so long, he didn't sleep well anyway. Might as well be doing something useful with his insomnia. Dr. Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She'd stay for a few more hours to ensure everything was stable, then head home with the understanding that James would call her immediately if anything changed. She showed him where supplies were kept, how to read the monitoring equipment she'd set up, and what signs to watch for. The night settled over the facility with a quiet that reminded James of desert nights during his deployments, that particular quality of silence that felt heavy and alive at the same time. Dr. Brennan had left around 9 in the evening after giving James detailed instructions one final time and making him promise to call if he had even the slightest concern. She'd set up a cot in an adjacent room, but James doubted he'd use it. He'd positioned a chair near the mare's stall where he could observe both horses while staying out of the way. The first few hours passed in a rhythm of checking vital signs, noting them in the log Dr. Brennan had provided, and observing the subtle changes in the mare's condition. Her temperature remained elevated but wasn't climbing, which James took as a small victory. Her breathing had improved slightly since the afternoon, no longer quite as labored, and occasionally she would shift her weight in small movements that suggested awareness of her surroundings. The foal slept in fits and starts, never fully relaxing, always maintaining some contact with his mother. Around midnight, James found himself talking to the horses again. The facility was empty except for them, and his voice was the only human sound in the darkness, punctuated by the soft breathing of animals and the occasional creak of the building settling. He told them about his daughter Sarah, named after his grandmother. He talked about how she'd been 6 years old when he'd left for his first deployment, how she'd clung to his leg at the airport and begged him not to go. He'd promised her he'd come back, and he had. But the man who came back wasn't quite the same as the one who left. James spoke about the gradual erosion of his marriage, how his ex-wife Janet had tried so hard to understand but couldn't bridge the gap between them. He didn't blame her anymore, though it had taken years to reach that point. She'd married a man who laughed easily and shared his feelings, and she'd ended up with a stranger who woke up screaming from nightmares and couldn't bear to be in crowds. The divorce had been quiet and sad, two people who still cared about each other but couldn't find a way to exist in the same space anymore. The mare's ear twitched toward him as he spoke, and James chose to believe she was listening. The foal had woken and was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to comprehend more than should be possible. James reached out slowly, and the young horse allowed him to stroke his neck. The coat was soft despite the ordeal, and James could feel the rapid heartbeat beneath his palm. This foal had been loved, that much was clear. Someone had cared for him properly before whatever circumstances had led to the current tragedy. At 2 in the morning, during his scheduled check, James noticed a change. The mare's eyes were more alert, tracking his movements as he approached to check her temperature and pulse. She made a soft sound, not quite a whinny, but a low vocalization that made the foal immediately scramble to his feet. James spoke soothingly to both of them, explaining what he was doing as he went through his checks. The mare's temperature had dropped slightly, still elevated, but moving in the right direction. Her pulse was stronger, more regular. These were good signs. indications that her body was responding to treatment. Emboldened by these improvements, James made a decision. He opened the stall door and stepped inside, moving slowly and keeping up his steady stream of quiet conversation. The foal watched him carefully but didn't seem alarmed. James lowered himself to sit cross-legged on the ground near the mare's head, close enough to monitor her, but far enough to give her space. The foal, after a moment of consideration, approached and nudged James's shoulder with his nose. It was a gesture of acceptance, of trust, and it affected James more deeply than he would have expected. He sat there in the dim light of the stall, one hand resting lightly on the mare's neck so he could feel her breathing and pulse, the other occasionally reaching up to stroke the foal who had settled beside him. James found himself thinking about purpose and connection, about how 3 years of isolation had been his attempt to avoid pain, but had instead created a different kind of suffering. The absence of connection wasn't safety, it was just emptiness. These horses, strangers to him 12 hours ago, had somehow reminded him of what it meant to care about something outside himself. The hours between 2 and 5 in the morning were always the hardest, James knew from countless nights of insomnia, the time when the mind played its cruelest tricks, when regrets felt sharpest and hope seemed most distant. But tonight, sitting in this stall with 2 horses who needed him, James found those hours passing differently. Instead of dwelling on the past or worrying about the future, he was completely present in this moment. Every breath the mare took, every small shift in her position, every time the foal pressed against him for comfort, all of it anchored him firmly in the now. Around 4:30, something remarkable happened. The mare, who had been lying still for hours, began to move with more purpose. Her head lifted slightly, and she made another of those soft vocalizing sounds. The foal immediately responded, moving to her head and nuzzling her gently. James watched in fascination as the mare, despite her injuries and weakness, seemed to draw strength from her baby's presence. She managed to lift her head higher, her eyes more focused than they'd been since James first found her. James quickly but calmly moved to check her vital signs again, even though it wasn't time for the scheduled check. What he found made his heart race with cautious optimism. Her temperature had dropped another degree, her pulse was notably stronger, and when he gently touched the area around the splinted leg, being extremely careful, the swelling seemed slightly reduced. The mare was fighting. Against all odds and professional expectations, she was choosing to fight for her life. He immediately called Dr. Brennan, knowing she'd want to hear this regardless of the early hour. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice alert despite the time, the mark of someone used to emergency calls. James reported the changes he'd observed, trying to keep his voice level and professional, even though excitement was bubbling up inside him. Dr. Brennan listened carefully, asked several specific questions, then told him this was indeed good news. Not a guarantee by any means, she cautioned, but definitely encouraging. She'd come in early, around 6, to do a thorough examination. After hanging up, James allowed himself a moment of pure relief. He looked at the foal, who was still attending to his mother with single-minded devotion, and felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This young horse had done something extraordinary. He'd somehow known that his mother needed help, had figured out where to find it, and had possessed the courage to seek out a stranger for assistance. The intelligence and love required for such actions was humbling. James resumed his position near the mare, and the foal returned to his spot pressed against James's side. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky visible through the facility's windows, James Morrison sat in that stall and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope that fears disappointment, but the solid, grounded hope that comes from witnessing resilience and determination. The mare was fighting for her life, the foal was fighting for his mother, and somewhere along the way James had started fighting again too, for something beyond just his own survival. Dr. Brennan arrived just as the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink. James heard her truck pull up and reluctantly extracted himself from the stall, his joints protesting after hours of sitting in one position. He met her at the entrance to the facility, and she immediately noted his appearance. His clothes were rumpled, his face showed the exhaustion of a sleepless night, but his eyes were bright with something she recognized as hope, tempered with determination. She listened carefully as James provided a detailed report of the night's observations, impressed by his thoroughness and the precision of his notes. He documented every vital sign check, noted every small change in behavior or condition, and had even sketched rough diagrams of the mare's positions throughout the night. It was clear this wasn't just a concerned civilian doing his best, but someone with actual training and experience in medical observation. Dr. Brennan felt her initial assessment of James' shift. This was a man who understood what it meant to fight for a life. Together they entered the stall, and Dr. Brennan began her examination. The mare, who had been dozing lightly, opened her eyes as the veterinarian approached. There was an awareness in that gaze that hadn't been present the day before, and Dr. Brennan felt her own cautious optimism growing. She worked methodically, checking the splinted leg for any signs of increased swelling or heat that might indicate worsening infection, listening to the mare's heart and lungs, taking her temperature, and examining the various minor wounds for healing progress. When she finished, Dr. Brennan sat back and looked at James with an expression that mixed professional caution with genuine surprise. She told him that the mare's improvement overnight had exceeded her expectations. The infection appeared to be responding to the antibiotics, and the mare's overall vital signs had stabilized significantly. It wasn't a guarantee of survival, she emphasized, but it moved them from crisis management to cautious optimism. If this trend continued for another 24 hours, they could begin discussing the possibility of surgery to properly repair the leg. James felt relief flood through him, so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. He'd been maintaining such tight control over his emotions, falling back on military discipline to keep himself steady, but Dr. Brennan's words cracked through that control. He turned away slightly, not wanting her to see the tears that were threatening, but she seemed to understand. She placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect, then moved to examine the foal, who had been watching the entire exchange with anxious attention. The young horse allowed Dr. Brennan to check him over, though he kept glancing at his mother throughout the examination. She pronounced him healthy despite his ordeal, showing resilience that spoke to his strong constitution and the good care he'd received before the tragedy. Dr. Brennan estimated he was about 4 months old and likely born on the Henderson property. She mentioned that once the immediate crisis with the mare was past, they'd need to figure out the legal situation regarding ownership of both horses, since they'd been found on abandoned property. James hadn't considered the ownership question, and it struck him now as potentially complicated. The Henderson property had no heirs that anyone knew of, and the estate had been in legal limbo for over a year. These horses had likely belonged to Henderson or had been born wild on his land after his death. The thought of the foal and mare being separated, sold to different owners, or sent to auction filled James with a fierce protectiveness he hadn't anticipated. He told Dr. Brennan he'd look into the legal issues, but his tone made it clear he considered these horses under his protection now. Dr. Brennan studied him for a moment, then suggested they discuss the practical matters over coffee in her office. James agreed, though he was reluctant to leave the stall. The foal seemed to sense this and approached him, pressing his soft nose into James's palm. It was such a simple gesture, but it carried weight. Trust. Connection. James promised the young horse he'd be back soon, then followed Dr. Brennan to her office adjacent to the stables. The office was functional but comfortable, with filing cabinets along one wall, a desk covered in neat stacks of paperwork, and a small kitchenette in the corner. Dr. Brennan started a pot of coffee and gestured for James to sit. As the coffee brewed, she pulled out a folder and laid out the financial reality of the situation. The emergency call, transport, initial treatment, medication, and overnight care had already accumulated to nearly $3,000. If they proceeded with surgery, which she strongly recommended given the mare's improved condition, they were looking at another $6,000 to $8,000 minimum. Post-surgical care, follow-up treatments, and the months of recovery would add several thousand more. James listened to the figures, feeling each one like a weight added to his shoulders. His savings account had about $15,000, money he'd been holding on to without any real purpose beyond a vague sense of needing to be prepared for emergencies. He'd lived frugally on his retirement income, having few expenses and no particular ambitions that required money. Now, looking at the potential cost of saving the mare, he understood that this would consume most of his financial cushion. If complications arose, it could take everything. Dr. Brennan watched him process the information, then asked him directly if he was prepared to commit to this financially. She needed to know before proceeding because surgery was a point of no return. Once they started down that path, stopping halfway would be cruel. James took the cup of coffee she offered, wrapped his hands around its warmth, and thought about the question seriously. He thought about the foal's journey to find him, about sitting in that barn all night feeling purpose for the first time in years, about the way the mare had lifted her head that morning as if choosing to keep fighting. He told Dr. Brennan he was committed. Whatever it cost, whatever it took, he would see this through. The money in his account had been sitting there representing nothing but fear of an uncertain future. At least this way, it would mean something. It would represent a choice to fight for life, to invest in something beyond his own small world of isolation and routine. Dr. Brennan nodded, and James could see respect in her expression. She told him she'd schedule the surgery for the following day if the mare continued to improve. She'd bring in a specialist, a surgeon she'd worked with on complex cases before because this repair would require expertise beyond her own. They discussed the procedure in detail. Dr. Brennan explained how they would need to place pins and plates to hold the bone fragments in alignment, how the recovery would involve a support sling to keep weight off the leg for weeks, how infection remained a constant risk even after surgery. The mare would need intensive care, constant monitoring, and months of careful rehabilitation. Even with everything going perfectly, there was no guarantee she'd walk normally again. She might always have a limp, might never be able to run free in a pasture the way horses were meant to. James absorbed all of this, then asked a question that revealed where his heart was. He asked if the mare would be in pain during recovery, if the life she'd have afterward would be worth living. Dr. Brennan considered the question carefully before answering. She told him that horses were remarkably resilient, and with proper pain management and care, the mare could have a good quality of life. She wouldn't be a working horse, wouldn't be suitable for riding or breeding, but she could live comfortably, could be a companion to her foal as he grew, could have years of peace in a good home. That was enough for James. The mare deserved a chance at that life, and the foal deserved to have his mother. He authorized the surgery and told Dr. Brennan to bring in whoever she needed, to spare no expense in giving the mare the best possible chance. She updated the treatment plan and assured him she'd call the surgeon immediately. If everything went well, they'd operate tomorrow afternoon. In the meantime, James needed to go home, shower, eat something, and get at least a few hours of sleep. She wouldn't let him be present during the surgery anyway, and he'd be no good to anyone if he collapsed from exhaustion. James started to protest not wanting to leave the horses, but Dr. Brennan was firm. She told him that the foal had formed an attachment to him, something that was clear to anyone watching. and that attachment meant James needed to take care of himself. The young horse would need him in the days and weeks ahead. This wasn't a sprint, it was a marathon, and James needed to pace himself. Reluctantly, he agreed. Before leaving, though, he needed to see the horses one more time. Back in the stall, James knelt beside the mare and stroked her neck gently. He told her about the surgery, about how they were going to fix her leg properly, about how she needed to keep fighting just a little longer. The mare's eyes followed him, and he chose to believe she understood on some level. The foal pressed against his side, and James hugged the young horse, feeling the rapid heartbeat and the trust implicit in how the foal leaned into him. He promised them both he'd be back soon. The drive back to his property felt surreal to James. He'd left just yesterday morning, a man going through the motions of another empty day, and now he was returning as someone fundamentally altered. The landscape looked the same, the familiar roads and fields unchanged, but James saw them through different eyes. Everything seemed sharper, more vivid, as if color had been gradually draining from his world for 3 years and was suddenly restored in full saturation. When he pulled into his driveway, Sergeant the goat was waiting by the fence, bleating indignantly at having been neglected. James couldn't help but smile at the cranky animal's demands. He took care of his small menagerie, feeding the chickens and goat while his mind remained partially at the veterinary facility, with 2 horses who had somehow become central to his existence in less than 24 hours. The routine tasks felt different now, imbued with purpose rather than just the mechanical fulfillment of basic responsibilities. Inside his house, James stood under the shower for a long time, letting hot water wash away the grime and exhaustion of the past day. But even as his body began to relax under the stream, his mind was active, replaying every moment from the foal's arrival on his porch to the conversation with Dr. Brennan about surgery costs. He thought about the $15,000 in his savings account and the decision he'd made to spend most of it on animals he'd only just met. By any rational measure, it was foolish. He barely had enough income to support himself, and one major emergency could wipe him out financially. Yet as he dried off and dressed in clean clothes, James felt no regret about his choice. The money had been sitting there unused because he'd been sitting in his life unused. He'd been existing, but not living, surviving, but not thriving. The past day had reminded him of something essential about himself, something the military had cultivated and civilian life had buried. He was someone who acted when action was needed, who stepped up when others stepped back, who found purpose in serving something beyond his own comfort and safety. James tried to sleep but managed only a few fitful hours, his mind too active with worry and hope. He finally gave up around noon and made himself a proper meal, realizing he'd eaten almost nothing since yesterday morning. As he prepared food, his phone rang. It was Martha Chen, the ranch owner who'd given him Dr. Brennan's number. Word had apparently spread through the small community about the dramatic rescue, and Martha wanted to check in. She asked about the mare's condition, and James found himself telling her the whole story, including details about the surgery planned for tomorrow. Martha listened carefully, then surprised James by offering help. She told him she had experience with rehabilitating injured horses and would be happy to provide guidance once the mare was past the critical stage. More than that, she offered the use of one of her recovery pastures once the mare was well enough to leave Dr. Brennan's facility. It was a generous offer, one that would save James considerable money on boarding costs. He accepted gratefully, touched by the kindness from someone who was essentially a stranger. After hanging up, James found himself thinking about community, something he'd actively avoided since his discharge. He'd told himself he preferred solitude, that he didn't need people, but now he wondered if that had been fear disguised as preference. Martha's offer, Dr. Brennan's dedication, even Kyle, the transport driver's careful handling of the mare, all of it represented a network of people who cared about animals and were willing to help. James had been so focused on his isolation that he'd forgotten people like this existed. The afternoon passed slowly as James tried to keep busy with tasks around his property. He fixed a section of fence that had needed attention for months, organized his barn, and even started cleaning out areas he'd been neglecting. The physical work felt good, purposeful, and it kept his mind from spiraling into worry about the surgery. Several times he found himself pulling out his phone to call Dr. Brennan for updates, but he stopped himself. She'd told him she'd contact him if anything changed, and he needed to trust that. As evening approached, James's phone finally rang with Dr. Brennan's number displayed. His heart jumped as he answered, immediately asking if something was wrong. She assured him the mare was stable and continuing to improve. She was calling to inform him that the surgeon, Dr. Michael Torres, had reviewed the case files and scans they'd taken that afternoon. Dr. Torres was confident he could repair the leg and had scheduled the surgery for 10 o'clock the following morning. Dr. Brennan wanted James to know the procedure would take approximately 4 hours, and he was welcome to wait at the facility, though he wouldn't be allowed in the surgical suite. James thanked her for the call and asked about the foal. Doctor. Brennan's voice softened as she told him the young horse had been restless after James left, but had eventually settled down. She'd allowed him to remain in the stall with his mother, and he seemed to understand that his presence was important. She mentioned something that struck James deeply. She said that in all her years of practice, she'd never seen an animal display the level of devotion and intelligence the foal had shown. What he'd done was extraordinary, and it suggested a bond between mother and baby that was unusually strong even by horse standards. That night, James actually slept for several hours, exhaustion finally overwhelming his anxious mind. He dreamed of horses running free across open plains, of a young foal keeping pace with a mare whose legs were strong and whole. When he woke just after dawn, he felt something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of nervousness and determination and hope all tangled together. Today would determine whether the mare would live or die, whether the foal's remarkable journey to find help would ultimately save his mother. James prepared for the day with the same care he'd once used before important missions. He dressed practically, packed a bag with things he might need for a long wait, and made sure his phone was fully charged. Before leaving, he stood on his porch and looked out over his property, the same view he'd had yesterday morning when the foal first appeared. So much had changed in such a short time. He'd changed in such a short time. The isolation that had felt like protection now felt like a prison he'd built for himself, and these horses had somehow provided a key to unlock it. The drive to Dr. Brennan's facility felt both too long and too short. James wanted to be there immediately, but he also felt the weight of what the day would bring. When he arrived, the parking area already held several vehicles, including a large truck he assumed belonged to Dr. Torres. James took a deep breath, grabbed his bag, and headed inside. Dr. Brennan met him in the reception area, looking professional and focused in her surgical scrubs. She updated him on the mare's morning vitals, all positive, and introduced him to Dr. Torres, a man in his 50s with steady hands and kind eyes. Dr. Torres shook James's hand and spoke to him with the straightforward honesty James appreciated. He explained the procedure in detail, the risks involved, and the realistic expectations for recovery. The surgery itself had a good chance of success, but the real test would be whether the mare's body accepted the hardware and whether infection could be kept at bay during the critical healing period. James listened carefully, asked a few questions that revealed his medical knowledge, and then told Dr. Torres to do whatever he thought was best. Before they took the mare to surgery, Dr. Brennan allowed James a few minutes with both horses. He entered the stall to find the foal standing guard over his mother, who was already showing the effects of pre-surgical sedation. James knelt beside the mare and placed his hand on her neck, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin. He told her she was strong, that she'd already survived so much, and that all she needed to do was keep fighting a little longer. The mare's eyes found his face, and James felt that same inexplicable connection he'd experienced from the beginning. The foal was harder to comfort. The young horse sensed something significant was happening and became agitated as the surgical team began preparing to move his mother. James wrapped his arms around the foal's neck and spoke directly to him, promising that his mother would come back, that these people were going to help her. The foal trembled against him, and James felt tears sting his eyes. This brave young animal who had accomplished the impossible now had to face the hardest part of all, waiting and trusting that the humans would keep their promises. The waiting was its own special kind of torture. James had experienced plenty of difficult waits during his military career, times when his unit was held in reserve while others went into combat, moments before missions when every second stretched into eternity. But this felt different, more personal somehow. He'd chosen this battle, had invested not just money but something deeper into the outcome. The mare's survival mattered to him in a way that surprised him with its intensity. Dr. Brennan had set up James in a comfortable waiting area with coffee and access to facilities, but he couldn't settle. He paced the room for the first hour, checking his watch every few minutes, calculating how much time had passed and how much might remain. The surgical suite was in a separate section of the building, and James had no way to know what was happening beyond those closed doors. He tried to distract himself with his phone, scrolling through news he didn't care about, but nothing held his attention. Around the second hour, James made a decision. He asked the receptionist if he could spend time with the foal instead of sitting alone in the waiting room. She checked with Dr. Brennan via text and came back with approval. James felt relief wash over him as he made his way to the stall where the young horse had been confined during his mother's surgery. The foal was pacing restlessly, clearly distressed by the separation, and when James entered, the animal immediately came to him. James sat down on the clean straw bedding and let the foal press against him, seeking comfort in his presence. He wrapped his arms around the young horse's neck and felt the rapid heartbeat, the trembling muscles, the fear that the foal couldn't express in words, but communicated through every fiber of his being. James understood that fear intimately. It was the same helpless terror he'd felt watching wounded soldiers being evacuated, knowing their fate was in others' hands and all he could do was hope and wait. He talked to the foal continuously, his voice low and steady. He told stories about his grandfather's ranch, about the horses he'd known as a child and the lessons they'd taught him about patience and resilience. He talked about his daughter, Sarah, and how she'd loved animals as a little girl, how she'd begged for a pony every birthday until she turned 12 and discovered other interests. James realized as he spoke that he was sharing parts of himself he'd kept locked away for years, memories that brought both joy and pain but needed to be acknowledged rather than buried. The foal gradually calmed under James's attention, his breathing slowing to match the veteran's steady rhythm. At some point, the young horse lay down beside James, resting his head in the man's lap with complete trust. James stroked the soft coat and felt something crack open in his chest, some final barrier he'd been maintaining against genuine connection. This foal had chosen him, had trusted him with the most important thing in his young life, and James understood the profound responsibility that trust carried. Time moved differently in that stall. James lost track of how long he sat there with the foal, focused entirely on providing comfort and stability to the anxious animal. He was so absorbed that he didn't hear Dr. Brennan approach until she spoke his name softly from the stall entrance. James looked up, his heart in his throat, trying to read her expression for signs of good or bad news. Dr. Brennan's face broke into a tired but genuine smile, and James felt his entire body sag with relief before she even spoke the words. The surgery had been successful. Dr. Torres had managed to set all 3 fractures and had placed pins and plates that would hold the bones in proper alignment during healing. The mare had tolerated the procedure well, her vital signs remaining stable throughout. She was currently in recovery, still under sedation, but the critical part was over. They'd done everything possible to give her the best chance at healing. James stood on shaky legs, his body protesting after hours on the hard floor, but he barely noticed the discomfort. He asked when he could see her, and Dr. Brennan explained that she'd need another hour or so to fully emerge from anesthesia. The foal could be reunited with his mother at that point, though they'd need to monitor the young horse carefully to ensure he didn't accidentally bump the surgical site. James nodded, absorbing the information, feeling hope bloom in his chest alongside lingering worry. The surgery was successful, but as Dr. Brennan reminded him, they weren't out of danger yet. The next few weeks would be critical. Infection remained a significant risk, and the mare would need to be kept in a support sling to prevent her from putting weight on the injured leg. She'd require round-the-clock monitoring, regular medication, and careful wound care. Dr. Brennan had space at her facility for the mare's initial recovery, but eventually they'd need to arrange longer-term care. James told her about Martha Chen's offer of a recovery pasture, and Dr. Brennan nodded approvingly. She knew Martha's operation and agreed it would be an excellent place for the mare's extended rehabilitation. An hour later, James was allowed into the recovery area where the mare lay on padded mats, suspended partially in a specialized sling that took weight off her legs, while allowing her to rest comfortably. She was conscious but groggy, her eyes unfocused and confused. The surgical site was bandaged professionally, and various monitors tracked her vital signs. The foal had been brought in under Dr. Brennan's supervision, and the moment he saw his mother, he rushed to her side, whinnying softly. The mare's head lifted at the sound of her baby's voice, and her eyes focused with obvious effort. She made a soft sound in return, and the foal pressed his nose against her face in a gesture of such pure love and relief that James had to turn away briefly, overwhelmed by emotion. Dr. Brennan stood beside him and spoke quietly, acknowledging that moments like this were why she'd become a veterinarian. The bond between animals, the capacity for love and devotion they displayed, reminded her constantly that her work mattered. James watched the reunion between mother and foal, saw how the mare seemed to draw strength from her baby's presence despite her pain and confusion. He thought about the journey they'd all taken over the past 2 days, how a desperate young horse's impossible quest had led to this moment. The mare was still facing a long road to recovery, still at risk from infection and complications, but she was alive. She had a chance, and that chance had come because her foal refused to give up on her. Dr. Torres came by to check on his patient and spoke with James about the post-surgical care plan. He explained that the first 72 hours after surgery were critical for watching for complications, particularly infection and rejection of the hardware. If the mare could get through that window without major issues, her chances of successful recovery increased significantly. He'd be checking in daily, and Dr. Brennan would be monitoring constantly. James asked what he could do to help, and Dr. Torres smiled at his eagerness. The surgeon told James that the best thing he could do was continue what he'd been doing, providing stability and calm for both horses. Animals responded to emotional energy, and James's steady presence seemed to have a positive effect on both the mare and her foal. Dr. Torres mentioned that he'd heard from Dr. Brennan about James's military background and his overnight vigil before the surgery. That kind of dedication and discipline was invaluable in situations like this. If James was willing to continue helping with monitoring and care during the recovery period, his contribution would be genuinely valuable. James agreed immediately, feeling purpose surge through him once again. He told Dr. Torres he'd do whatever was needed as often as needed. The surgeon nodded approvingly and clapped him on the shoulder before leaving to check on his next patient. Dr. Brennan remained, and she and James discussed the practical arrangements for the coming days. James would spend nights at the facility, monitoring the mare and providing company for the foal, who clearly found his presence comforting. Dr. Brennan and her staff would handle the medical interventions, But James would be the constant, the stable presence that helped both horses feel safe. As evening fell on that second day since the foal had appeared on his porch, James settled into a chair positioned where he could watch both horses. The mare was resting quietly, her breathing steady, and her vital signs stable according to the monitors. The foal had finally relaxed enough to lie down near his mother, though he positioned himself where he could see James as well. The veteran looked at these two animals who had stumbled into his life so unexpectedly and felt gratitude wash over him. They'd needed him, yes, but he was beginning to understand that he'd needed them just as much. The critical 72 hours after surgery passed with agonizing slowness, each hour marked by careful monitoring and constant vigilance. James barely left the facility, catching sleep in short stretches, while Dr. Brennan and her staff maintained their professional watch over the mare. Every vital sign check brought either relief or concern, every small change in the mare's condition analyzed and discussed. But gradually, steadily, the news remained positive. The mare's temperature stayed within normal range, the surgical site showed no signs of infection, and her body appeared to be accepting the hardware that now held her shattered bones together. On the fourth day post-surgery, Dr. Torres came for his daily examination and declared himself cautiously optimistic. The mare had cleared the most dangerous window, and while months of recovery still lay ahead, the immediate crisis had passed. He adjusted her medication, approved the gradual reduction of sedation, and told James that the mare's survival was now more likely than not. Those words, spoken with professional certainty, hit James with unexpected force. She was going to make it. Against all odds and conventional wisdom, this mare was going to survive. The foal seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, his anxiety gradually transforming into something more like hope. He stayed close to his mother, but began showing interest in his surroundings again, exploring the larger recovery stall they'd been moved to and even playing briefly with a ball Dr. Brennan had provided. James watched the young horse's resilience with admiration, seeing in him the same determination that had driven him to seek help in the first place. This foal was a fighter, just like his mother. During the second week of recovery, James contacted a lawyer in town to investigate the ownership situation. What he learned was surprisingly straightforward. The Henderson property had been seized by the county for unpaid taxes, and any animals found on the land were considered abandoned. With no heirs claiming them, the horses could be legally adopted by whoever was willing to assume responsibility for their care. James filed the paperwork immediately, making official what had already become true in his heart. These horses were his family now. He named them, carefully, thoughtfully. The mare became Hope, for the gift she'd given him by choosing to fight. The foal he named Valor, honoring the extraordinary courage it had taken for such a young animal to seek help for his mother. When James spoke their names aloud for the first time, both horses seemed to respond, and Dr. Brennan joked that they approved of his choices. But there was truth beneath the humor. These names represented more than simple labels. They represented what James had rediscovered through caring for these animals, hope for the future, and the valor to face it. As Hope's condition continued to improve, plans were made to move her to Martha Chen's recovery pasture. Martha had prepared a special area with level ground, good shelter, and space for both horses to move safely, while Hope completed her long rehabilitation. The day of the transfer, James felt nervousness mixed with excitement. This would be Hope's first time outside since the surgery, her first glimpse of open sky and fresh grass in weeks. Dr. Brennan supervised the careful process of loading both horses into the transport trailer, and James rode along, unable to bear being separated from them. Martha's property was beautiful, rolling hills dotted with mature trees and several well-maintained pastures. The recovery area she'd prepared exceeded James's expectations, with a sturdy shelter, fresh water, and fencing designed to prevent any dangerous running while still allowing the horses freedom to move. When they unloaded Hope, Using a special ramp and taking extreme care with her healing leg, the mare lifted her head and breathed in the outdoor air with obvious pleasure. Valor immediately began exploring, staying close to his mother but clearly delighted by the space and grass. Martha became a regular presence in their lives, stopping by daily to check on the horses and share her expertise with James. Through her, he met other members of the local horse community, people who'd heard about the dramatic rescue and wanted to help. Someone donated high-quality feed, another contributed towards medical expenses, and several offered their time and knowledge to assist with Hope's ongoing rehabilitation. James, who had spent 3 years avoiding community, found himself surrounded by it. The months that followed were filled with small victories and gradual progress. Hope's leg healed slowly but steadily, and the day she took her first unaided steps without the support sling was cause for celebration. She would always have a slight limp, as Dr. Brennan had predicted, but she could walk, could even manage a careful trot when Valor encouraged her to play. The foal grew rapidly, his coat gleaming with health, his personality emerging as confident and affectionate. He remained devoted to his mother but had also formed an unbreakable bond with James. James's own transformation was equally remarkable. The nightmares that had plagued him for years became less frequent, and when they did occur, he found comfort in going out to the pasture to sit with his horses. Something about their peaceful presence, their simple acceptance of him, helped quiet the demons that had haunted him for so long. He started attending a veterans support group, finding he had things to say after all, experiences to share that might help others struggling with their own transitions. His daughter Sarah called one evening, and James found himself telling her everything about Hope and Valor, about the journey that had begun with a desperate foal appearing on his porch. Sarah listened with growing emotion, and when he finished, she told him she wanted to visit, to meet these horses who had given her father back to her. That weekend visit stretched into a regular pattern, Sarah and her family coming to Montana every few months. James's grandchildren, whom he'd barely known, formed their own bonds with the horses, and James discovered the joy of sharing something he loved with people he loved. A year after that morning when Valor had first appeared, James stood in Martha's pasture, watching Hope and her now-grown son grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun. Hope moved with that characteristic limp, a permanent reminder of her ordeal, but she moved with contentment. Valor, magnificent in his maturity, stayed close to his mother as he always had, their bond as strong as ever. James thought about the man he'd been a year ago, isolated and convinced he preferred it that way, slowly fading into a shadow of himself. These horses had saved him just as surely as he'd helped save them. Valor's impossible journey to seek help had been about more than rescuing his mother. It had been about rescuing James, too, about pulling a broken veteran back from the edge of his own quiet despair and reminding him that life still held purpose, connection, and love. James had spent years trying to protect himself from pain by avoiding attachment, but these horses had taught him that avoiding pain meant avoiding life itself. Dr. Brennan stopped by that afternoon for a routine check on Hope's leg, though these visits had become as much about friendship as medical care. She examined the mare with satisfaction, pronouncing her recovery remarkable by any standard. As she packed up her equipment, she told James something she'd been thinking about for months. She said that what he and these horses had accomplished together was more than a rescue story. It was proof that healing was possible, that broken things could be mended, and that sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected places. James nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. He looked at Hope and Valor, at Dr. Brennan, who'd become a trusted friend, at the community that had embraced him, and felt gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. A year ago, a young foal had made an impossible choice to trust a stranger, And that choice had set in motion a chain of events that had saved 3 lives: the mare's, the foal's, and James's own. Standing in that peaceful pasture with the Montana sun warm on his face and his horses nearby, James Morrison understood that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for since leaving the military. He'd found his way home.